And we're live. So, welcome to the Beverage Study Group. Each week we do discussions like this. And this week we're going to be discussing the dynamics of political instability in the United States between 1782 and 2010. This is a paper by Peter Turchin. And Peter won't be joining us. We didn't ask him to. We're just fellow readers of the paper, and we're going to go through it and just share our thoughts. So you can find all the details in the description below. That will link you to this page where you can find a link to the paper, the abstract, link to a video, and a way to join our meetings for the future. And also here's my own notes for the paper. We'll be going through my notes here. I've highlighted some things and we'll be going through it. So I'll read out the abstract so everyone's on board, and then we'll take it from there, discussing the discussion points. So abstract. This article describes and analyzes a database of the dynamics. Oh, I'm actually getting feedback from you, John.
Okay. I'll mute myself.
Yep. This article describes and analyzes a database of the dynamics of socio-political instability in the United States between 1780 and 2010. The database was constructed by digitizing data collected by previous researchers, supplemented by systematic searches of electronic media archives. It includes 1,590 political violence events, such as riots, lynchings, and terrorism. Incidents of political violence fluctuated dramatically over the 230 years covered by the database, following a complex dynamical pattern. Spectral analysis detected two main oscillatory modes. The first is a very long-term secular cycle, taking the form of an instability wave during the second half of the 19th century, bracketed by two peaceful periods, the first quarter of the 19th century and the middle decades of the 20th century, respectively. The second is a 50-year oscillation superimposed on the secular cycle, with peaks around 1870, 1920, and 1970. The pattern of two periodicities superimposed on each other in this characteristic of the dynamics of political instability in many historical societies, such as ancient Rome and medieval and early modern England, France, and Russia. A possible explanation of this pattern, discussed in the article, is offered by the structural demographic theory, which postulates that labor oversupply leads to falling living standards and elite overproduction, and those in turn cause a wave of prolonged and intense socio-political instability. So we're reading this paper as a follow-on from the previous few papers Beverly has read relating to propaganda, as well as identity formation, and as well as identity challenges. So when identity is significantly challenged, one is now forced to deal with cognitive dissonance or rectify it to an extent. And then that will then promote a shift. But in most times, people are very balancing and harmonious with their identity. So they won't go out and they won't radicalize if there's not a particular need to.
It's interesting.
Want to fit in.
Yeah. The paper was written as part of the Journal of Peace Research.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
What it was called. Yeah, so it's really interesting to sort of see what the sort of motivation, or maybe not even the motivations of the paper, but what are the conclusions that can be drawn to this. Like, ideally, by having a theory of what causes political instability within societies, we can structure society so as to mitigate these types of political instabilities from coming about. And so this is sort of him putting forward, I guess it's his theory, the structural demographic theory, that, if I'm understanding, I think in one of his notes, he actually summarizes what the theory is. In summary, the theory suggests the following generalization. Labor oversupply should lead to the falling living standards and elite overproduction, which in turn should result in a wave of prolonged and intense socio-political instability. So that's his theory that he has. And his term there, the elite overproduction, is quite interesting. It's talking about a competition that's taking place over the high status sorts of jobs that are there. Like, you'll have the the types of jobs that people will want to have because they're for multiple reasons. But there's too many people wanting those jobs that are capable of having those jobs, but not enough of a demand for those jobs. So that's the elite overproduction. And that's what's leading to these types of competitions and exchanges, which are leading, or some sort of like inequality between the classes, basically, which leads to some sort of intense socio-political instability, as at least his theory is sort of putting forward.
Right. And Peter's goal for this was also not just to find something that would be applicable to the USA, but to find something that would be universally applicable. The reasoning that causes these instabilities needs to be something which isn't particularly circumstantial. Or at least I should say that the reasoning for those things at the time is circumstantial, but for the analysis that he's trying to form and for the predictive quality that is necessary, it needs to be something that isn't circumstantial to any specific event. It needs to be something that says when these things occur technically, we can then make assessments and have things that could offer predictive qualities of when we should expect and what we should expect going forward by looking at history. It's similar to that old maxim of like those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So it's actually quite similar, because if we jump into his final graph here on the USA, let me share my screen. I took a lot of notes. Actually, I don't want to share the whole screen. I just want to.
I should say the paper is laid out so that he's sort of like presenting the argument and the theory, and then like the latter half of the paper is going through the entire sort of back history of the United States to sort of show all the sort of dips and peaks in political instability as measured through. I think he uses like news media with mentions of the word riots or something like that, and all those instances and other types of political instabilities that took place over our history, or my history, not your history, and then able to track that on a graph to see what were the prerequisite conditions to these types of dips in political instabilities or rises in it.
Right. Yeah, so this is the last page of the last bit. It really sums it up. It like probably with most valuable things to know, as you go through it, it actually gets more and more interesting. So it always starts off a little bit benign, but then as you get it, you start realizing more and more the impacts. So his final chart here is all the different factors, the variables that.
Can you zoom in a little bit more? On that chart.
I have this. Okay, cool. It adjusts the font size and everything. Oh, you probably want bigger. Is that better? Is it like the issue? Is that better? Or do you want me to see if I can bump the font?
No, that's better. That way we can kind of actually see the lines on the graph, and as well as what the color associated with them are.
Right. Oh, well, I added the colors and everything. So. But so the point here is we can see I've added for the thresholds these gray thick black lines. So we have the peak threshold. This was reached in 1860, around then, and we also have the peak on stability, which was around 1820. And then through 1940 to 1960, there was also a bit of a peak of stability. Now, obviously, there was the world wars and things happening, right? But this is that's extra to the USA. It's not intra USA. So it's talking about things that actually affect political or instability within the USA.
Yeah, from like infighting, like he doesn't count the 9/11 attacks as some sort of like example of political instability, because that's not something from within. It's an exogenous. Yeah, I think that's how it's pronounced. Exogenous.
Exogenous.
Okay. Yeah.
Exogenous, exogenous.
Intrusion onto the political affairs. So as to in order to
Exogenous. Is it?
whatever.
Exogenous?
I think it's exogenous because it's like endogenous, it would be from within, exogenous would be from without.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah. So yeah, in order to actually make his case, he's only using the relevant data, or what he was using as relevant data. I think he also talked about how he didn't exactly include all of the deaths from, say, the American Civil War, just because that's not, it's more, I forget his exact reasoning behind it, but it's something that would completely sort of break the rest of the graph in by having too high of an example, because it's like what measures by thousands more than any of the other examples of like the worst shooting or something that happened within society.
Right. Yeah. So in the section here, he defines the criteria that he's used in the creation of his assessment and database and how he's categorized it. It's pretty interesting. Before we get into that, I just want to cover for the value of a paper like this. So here, we have another peak of stability between 1940 and 1960. But you see these trends. So he talked about it where there was a secular oscillation and then also what was the other word he used? Like a temporal oscillation.
Temporal piece.
Yeah, two periodicities.
Yeah, the secular cycle and then the two peaceful periods.
All right. Yeah. And okay. And the second is a 50-year oscillation superimposed on the secular cycle. So yeah, there's this meta, like this larger cycle, the secular cycle, and then there's this 50-year, like little bumps. Yeah. So we see actually from 1970, or around 1960, things actually started getting worse, in the USA. And if we're going to take on board what happened previously, this will continue for about 50 years and then it will get better. That's the thing here. So it's kind of interesting. So if we take into account, so right here is earlier, so some of the data. So we'll see in, and just need to make this a little bit bigger. So the instability events. So there was pretty much nothing between 1780 and 1840. However, there was a hell of a lot of deaths. But that's because there was a civil war happening, right? So one event, many different deaths. But one event also means a lot of cohesion, to an extent. So higher events actually means more, what's the opposite of cohesion?
Discohesion.
Discohesion. Discohesion or fragmentation, I guess. And and then you have these two peaks. These ones are the really interesting ones. So these are kind of like events that seem to also kind of propagate to, or quell these 50-year periods. And then we see here.
Are those two peaks? What is that? The Civil War and then during the Great Depression? I think that's.
So it's about 1870 and then about 1920. 1860. So, okay. So there was the issue of the Revolutionary War died out, and he attributes these to kind of aftershocks afterwards.
Both of those time periods. So there's a lot of political instability during the Civil War, even despite even discounting all the deaths from the actual wars itself, but from the different riots and things like that are taking place. Just because that was a time in American history where people were so politically divided. Well, like as far as you could be politically divided, in the fact that you have the entire country actually siding against itself. And then the other point in time is during the Great Depression, when there's a lot of scarcity and being able, and a lot of job loss and a lot of other things like that, which would also lead to a lot of political instability as well.
Right. Yeah. As someone who's not American, I'm not this paper is my introduction to a lot of these events. Yeah, but so what's interesting here is this little bit, which is there is a rise here. And there is also a big, like, at least for the run around 1920, there's a lot more events, but not as much death. So that's this little area here of why it's unusual, 1920, that box on the second chart. But then another unusual thing is another spike in actually deaths and fatalities, even though events is continuing up in a linear fashion. That's the one on the around 1990. And
Probably the LA riots, I guess. Yeah, there's a lot of political instability in as well. Yeah.
Well, so it's interesting. So here he now breaks down, well, what is the different contributing factors and how it's done. So we actually see it where riots is most common up until 1980, and then lynchings and then terrorism. So all through American history prior to 1980, riots were pretty much more common than lynchings than terrorism. And they kind of went in a correlated or not a like a influential
similar distribution between each other.
Yeah, a similar distribution. But then for some reason in 1980, terrorism just so domestic terrorism. And then this is so.
And also mentioning that at some point lynchings dropped down to near
nothing, which we can see. So he talks about that, like what are some causes for this, and this is where there's opportunity for some more open discussion, which we could get into just after we've kind of covered the assessment of the paper. So yeah, we see this difference in trends. So this is something new, and he kind of talks about it a little bit. So here's kind of like the little, wait, where's the bit where he breaks it down? So this I found really interesting. So the way he's actually categorizing the different stuff. So he's got like, say, motivation stuff. Yeah, okay. So the motivations that led to the riot, the most common issues in the USPV database are race or ethnicity, labor management conflicts, and 3 politics, including election disputes and sectional conflicts before the Civil War. Let me just see if we're missing something that might be very important to, because I think I kind of want to dive into the notes. The one about China is probably the only other relevance thing before we go into a discussion. Where are those charts? Here. So this is the comparison to some other countries. I think here it's the Chinese dynasty. So taking over a way further time span, we kind of see other types of oscillations, where we can see there's these big spikes, and then there'll be the spike can like either bring in times of peace, or it brings in like a time of disarray. So it's kind of interesting, and he talks about this here. So I think to jump in,
does he give any? I should say I only read the first half of the paper and then sort of skimmed the rest. Does he give a sort of reasoning behind like when it's more likely that a spike in events will lead to political stability versus instability?
So in this one, he says in the paper somewhere that this one is focused only on a technical analysis. He's actually working on a paper, or has done another paper, which is then looking at the fundamental analysis. So if anyone's ever done like stock trading or anything before, there's technical traders that only look at the graphs, like the charts, and then there's fundamental traders which don't particularly look at the chart graphs, and then they just read the news, understand the companies, what they're doing in the market. So this one is doing like a technical analysis, and his other paper is looking at a more fundamental. But
I suppose
so
if you wanted to draw it into his theory, it could be the case that you have events that take place that lower the sort of competition in regards to the labor oversupply, or the elite overproduction is the term he uses. And so if that was the case, that might be more likely to lead towards the political stability, versus
right.
you could have other scenarios where there is still a lot of deaths or events that take place, but it does nothing to sort of level out the discrepancies between the marginalized, or not the marginalized, but the lower political class and the higher political class. He doesn't use that terminology, but he does talk about the elites and the competition towards the elite.
Right.
Yeah, jobs.
Yeah, so he focused, because at the beginning half or the beginning quarter, perhaps, he's trying to find out, is this theory that was applicable to agrarian societies, is it actually applicable to industrialized societies? And and this is kind of the assessment, because these are agrarian from the time span. We're talking about 500 BC to 400 after, what is it? What's the opposite of AD? And then we have 800 to 1700, and kind of talking about the different shaping factors, and then again looking at China over the very long period. So this is from 200 BC all the way to 19, or all the way pretty much to today. So looking at the different stuff. So it's like, okay, well, there is still trends that continue on. So I'll just read out this kind of assessment of what the trends are. So according to what's the theory? So the structural demographic theory. So such strong empirical patterns suggest that instability dynamics in agrarian societies may be governed by general mechanism or mechanisms. The structural demographic theory. Oh my God, what just happened? I clicked the wrong button. All right.
Yeah, that's his main theory that he's working off of through the paper, is the structural demographic theory, and then seeing where it applies given the data that we have.
Yeah. So according to this theory, population growth in excess of the productivity gains of the land has several effects on social on institutions. First, it leads to persistent price inflation, falling real wages, rural misery, urban migration, and increased frequency of food riots and wage protests. Rapid population growth also produces a youth bulge, and the growing size of the youth cohorts contribute to the mobilization potential of the populace. Second, rapid expansion of population results in elite overproduction. You mentioned that before, John. An increased number of aspirants for the limited supply of elite positions. Increased intra-elite competition leads to the formation of rival patronage networks vying for state rewards. As a result, elites become driven by increasing rivalry and factionalism. Third, population growth leads to expansion of the army and the bureaucracy and rising real costs. States have no choice but to seek and expand taxation, despite resistance from the elites and the general populace. Yet attempts to increase revenues cannot offset the spiraling state expenses. As all these trends intensify, the end result is a state fiscal crisis and bankruptcy and consequent loss of military control, elite movements of regional and national rebellion, and a combination of elite mobilized and popular uprisings that manifest the breakdown of central authority. Sociopolitical instability resulting from state collapse feeds back on population growth by demographic, birth, mortality, and emigration rates, and economic disruption of production mechanisms. Eventually, both popular immiseration and elite overproduction are abated, setting up conditions for the beginning of a new cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like from having gone through the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, John Vervaeke sort of begins it with the sort of recognition of there is this sort of meaning crisis within the United States and Canada and these Western countries by looking at the, I guess, effects of them. The fact that there is such distrust in all of our major institutions, our political institutions, our educational institutions, as well as our judicial institutions, things like that, and our religious institutions as well. And it's interesting with tying that in with this, you could kind of see how this actually had like Vervaeke is just sort of looking at the results of the meaning crisis, whereas was it Turchin? He's kind of showing like what could be the causes to these types of things that are occurring on this broad scale. Yeah.
Right. And not really the causes, it's more the symptoms. Like so the symptom or the ripples of effects over time, at least for this paper. So for instance, like, this is one effect. This is the consequence of that effect. This is a consequence of that effect. And eventually we come to, again, home, like equilibrium again. All the rippling of noise ends up canceling each other out and we get back to a new peaceful cycle. And that's actually really nice to have as a perspective. And I wrote a blog post earlier in the year on Medium called Where Does Socialism Fit In? And as well, I kind of argue this cyclic nature where you have like anarchism at midnight and then I think it was like libertarianism in the middle. So then you have like increased regulation, or at least increased collectivism, and then you have decreased, so like building up and then building down. So then from 6 p.m. to 6 from 12, then you have this tearing down again.
Right. It is somewhat of a relief that Turchin sort of paints that these types of things aren't like a death spiral where it just leads into sort of an ever increasing amount of war and death and poverty and all that, but rather there is sort of a bleak requirement in order to return back to the peaceful stage, that of like mass deaths or some sort of like re-upheaval of the system, or just people leaving just because of how impoverished they are from this, like there's basically not enough resources here, I'm going to move to a better location. And then that's what sort of balances things back out so that you can sort of return to that sort of more peaceful state.
Right. Yeah, there's a movie by Stanley Kubrick called Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And in it, there's this great scene because it's all about like the made in the time when everyone was freaking out about an arms race, like a nuclear arms race, and what they should do. And in it, Russia's built like this defense system. So like if any missiles land on Russia, then Russia will blow up all its bombs. And it was intended as a defense mechanism, but they hadn't yet announced it because the Russian president wanted to like surprises. So America like accidentally sent all these bombs to Russia and is about to blow the whole world up. So it's quite comedic where the point though is it's the peace is still like the goal. And then there's these cyclic things. So it's like, okay, even for the arm race, no one actually wants to blow the entire world up, probably besides some delusional people. So the thing is, well, by building that, you also help prevent escalation to an extent, which is actually important because later in the work, he deliberately discredits acts of terrorism due to mental illness. He doesn't view that as a political act. And his criteria for what is a political act is pretty reasonable. Like he explains it quite well. There's one more point in this, which is the population pressing against Malthusian limits causes instability to rise, while high instability depresses population growth, leading to population decline or stagnation. So I had to look at what Malthusian limits is, and it's when it's a theory projected onto a world that is agrarian, where if the population expands beyond the supply of food, then that will result in instability. Because the belief is that population grows exponentially, whereas food only scales linearly. But the Wikipedia page of it actually goes into, well, while it's not particularly true, it's actually better to rephrase it instead. So it can be restated in more general terms of supply-demand relations. When the supply of labor exceeds its demands, the price of labor should decrease, depressing living standards for the majority of population. So like a huge recession that affects most people, some people will be getting way rich. This always happens with any recession. There's a movement of capital, but it's recession when it's considered it affects the globals, which is a reduced living standards for most people. So here it's more talking about it's just a supply demand thing, an economic thing, but we need to also take into the economics of jobs and who has those jobs and whether we can facilitate those jobs, which actually lent like a lot of credence to like say Keynesian economics. So you have like microeconomics, which just focuses on like a free market, and if you maintain the liberties, then the market corrects itself. And then you have Keynesian economics, which is kind of the progressive camp of politics, which then says, hey, if we do these few little adjustments of a managed economy, or that the government's role is also to manage the economy to promote well-being for those within it. And it's on the assumption that that is actually possible. And then you have a debate between the free market capitalists and then the progressive capitalists or whatever it is, on whether or not adding those management, that macro management actually solves a problem, or whether it just adds more and more things that then need to be solved. So like introducing minimum wage, it has an intent. Does it actually achieve that intent, or does it cause other problems? And then those other problems, do they now need something else to be managed, and so on and so on. But at least this paper kind of gives some credence, not necessarily to those proposed solutions, but to that proposed intent. That intent of maybe if we find ways to manage the economy in specific ways, then we could starve off a whole lot of horrible things. So on this previous point, I'll just go through the discussion notes. So I've got, well, pre-World War II Japan. This is actually, we covered this in Eastern World War II history on the Beverly Channel, which is something I was looking into at the time with like, hey, the East actually have a very different perspective of World War II than the West does. And one of the readings we did was Japan actually had this huge population skyrocketing from increased wealth that afforded, the ability for children not to die. But then it caused a situation where now there was a lot of adults and too many adults than food. So they requested to the West to emigrate out.
But an actual instance of sort of Malthusian limits there. Like you're within an island, you have abundance of population, but not enough resources for them. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then they requested to it was like the precursor to the UN. There was a meeting, and then they were like, look, we need to emigrate out. Otherwise, catastrophe will be upon us, and we would have to force emigration out. And the Australian Prime Minister was like, F off, mate. And and then everyone was kind of, Canada kind of was just like, whatever the Aussie says. And then America was just like, don't bother us. We got our own troubles. So that was pretty much the whole thing. And then Japan it was either the choice, that's not the only perspective, of course, but the perspective that is portrayed in that was that Japan had to invade China, otherwise it would have been its own people to die. And that's tough. And it's not like, like these are symptoms of situations. It's not really good or bad. It's just effects. obviously there's good and bad things onto it, but then you're adding projections. All right, so now the other interesting thing was here, this area here is covered by the book, The Law by Frederick Baster, which is when you have a state and you allow that state to allow collective rights or lobbying for collective benefit, then you'll have a population now interested in competing for those state rewards. So by having a strong libertarian constitution, that intent then, whether or not it's a great idea or not, the intent at least is to prevent this type of group on group competition for the monopolistic force of state power. By giving everyone the same power, you avoid that. And then finally, why decentralized force finance? So population growth leads to expansion, army and bureaucracy. So this one I actually touch on later, because one of the issues that the world is facing right now is there is a rise of the means of destruction. The means of destruction is higher. That is also why it seems to be that there is a huge peak in terrorism. And if you have a centralized force, the only way they can protect against a decentralized force like suicide bombers is to sacrifice liberties tremendously, like what the NRA does with surveillance, or what happens in the UK where they have to shut down provocative materials to prevent rioting. So instead, what actually seems to be happening right now across West American influenced areas is a call to actually be like, hey, we actually want decentralized force because we're starting to think that a centralized force isn't on our side, which is kind of interesting. So a left libertarian, Cody Wilson, founded the company Defense Distributed, which is 3D printed guns. But he was influenced by the Marxists and the
anarchists,
Noam Chomsky and the anarchists and these people, which is the left libertarian. He was just like, shit, how do we actually protect ourselves from this coercive force? How do we, like, the same things a lot of the anarchists are really concerned about? And the answer to him was 3D printed guns. Yeah,
right.
Decentralized force. All right, so and here, this is just credence to a theory that I hope to one day figure out how to do a paper, because I haven't done a paper, but I raised it several times in Bear called Moral Economics. So we can see here that as these cycles go on, there's actually changing of moral sentiments. So in the beginning of the conflict, each act of violence triggers chains of revenge and counter revenge. With time, participants lose all restraints. Atrocities become common and conflict escalates in an accelerating, explosive fashion. After the initial explosion, however, violence drags on and on for years, and sometimes even for decades. Sooner or later, most people begin to yearn for the return of stability and an end to the fighting. The most psychopathic and violent leaders get killed off or lose their supporters. Violence, like a disease epidemic, burns out. Even though the fundamental causes that brought the conflict on in the first place may still be operating, the prevailing social mood swings in favor of cessation of conflict at all costs, and an uneasy truce gradually takes hold. Those people who direct...
reading that, it reminded me so much of sort of the backstory in Huxley's Brave New World, where he gives the justification for this sort of like utopic society where everyone is coddled into being like just happy all the time, and like underlings for the way that society is structured. The reasoning was what, the 7 Years War or something like that, or maybe it's longer than that. Maybe it was 9 years or something like that. But it was like they're recalling in the history that people were so sick of war happening that they were willing to accept some sort of like complete tyrannical stripping of all their liberties, so that they live in this highly structuralized hierarchical sort of pattern where you stick within your domain and you're happy there, and there's no room for any sorts of other violences or competitions to take place anymore within that book. Yeah.
Well, even just to add on to what you said, there's the like Brave New World was one of the inspirations for the Matrix series, right? And the Matrix series is we see it with Cypher and many of the other characters, which is you have some people, and we, from the personality distribution of ordinary men, you have and from the Milton experiments, you have about 5% of people who are dissenters, and about 15, another 10% which are vocal, no, another 15% which are kind of silent dissenters. So you have really about 5% who kind of are contrarian and want to challenge and break beyond the expectations, and then you have 50% who kind of follow what the moral mood is, or the social mood is, and then you have 30% who just care about winning. And it's kind of interesting because for the Matrix, you have the people who naturally break out of the Matrix. That's like Kid. And if you watch the Animatrix, there's the character Kid, and he naturally breaks out. There's several other characters who try. And then you also have those who take the pill through social, assistants who seem like they would be good. And then you also have those who actually opt for sabotaging the efforts of seeking reality because they view it as a disturbance to their peace. And they will kill and sabotage and do anything to protect their fantasy of peace. And that's the character Cypher in the first Matrix. And that's it's really fascinating, like the whole bit of it. But you also see it, just to be a bit more facetious. We have this even in modern times, right? Like often with through looking at the previous papers we've done about identity and identity disturbances, there's cognitive dissonance, and some people, when that gets challenged, it's too painful to resolve. So they will just push it under the rug and develop a complex, like a Jungian complex.
Well, you can also tie it into the political, or not even just political, but just the various group bonding sorts of identities that people hold. Like there's a quote from Jonathan Haidt where everybody has their central values. Like everybody wants to have truth, but they also want whatever values that are there for the identity of the group. And so if the truth comes in conflict with the central value of the group for some reason, well, that's when truth gets thrown under the bus. And so that can happen for any type of centrally held value for any group. That anytime the truth comes up against it, that's where well, we got to keep our group together. So we're just going to have to try to reinterpret this truth in such a way that it'll be able to fit. Otherwise, we're just going to have to get rid of it. And you see that all the time.
Yeah, that's books burning. Like book burning, it's the destruction of statues, the destruction of history, and yeah, that's funny. Yeah.
All right, you want to continue what you were reading? I have to actually go grab a charger cord, so I'll be right back.
Yep. So those people who directly experience civil war become immunized against it. While they are in charge, they keep things stable. The peaceful period lasts for a human generation, between 20 and 30 years. Eventually, however, the conflict-scared generation dies off or retires, and a new cohort arises. People who do not experience the horrors of civil war and are not immunized against it. If the long-term social forces that brought about the first outbreak of internal hostilities are still operating, then the society will slide into a second civil war. As a result, periods of intense conflict tend to recur with a period of roughly 2 generations, 40 to 60 years. These swings in the social mood may be termed bi-generational cycles because they involve alternating generations that are either prone to conflict or not. Another example of such social mood swings, also with a period of roughly 50 years, has been noted, for example, by Schlesinger in 1986. So this is interesting because just an application of this, an example of this would be the World Wars. In the World Wars, you had many men sent off and many men killed. And at least in Australia, I'm not sure about the US, but I imagine it's very similar. And considering all the movies and things I've consumed relating it, you have things where the men are gone for decades. Many homes now become fatherless. Many wives now took up, they didn't know if their husband was ever coming back. They may have, um, you know, for whatever reason, good reasons or bad reasons, had affairs or moved on to another partner, things like that. But then it causes a generation, the my parents' generation, which is the I think it's the baby boomers, um, where there wasn't really any father figures in the home, so the men kind of were a bit more uh poorly socialized or poorly guided on how to manifest their masculinity in productive and compassionate ways. And then that leads on to the millennial generation, um, where that ricocheting of men with many social issues or father figures with many social issues, because their fathers were dead or missing or dealing with the trauma of war, has now created a situation where the millennial culture is repellent to this broken father that we have. Um, and it's kind of interesting because then the next generation, depending on our guidance, will then be like, okay, how can we fix things? Each generation kind of also does it. There's another maxim I've heard. I'm not sure if it's actually true or not, which is the us generation, and then the me generation, and then the us generation, and the me generation, where it goes in a cycle from like parents having nothing to then hoarding everything. And then the next generation is like, oh, there's too much stuff. And then they go minimalist. Um, and it's also like focus. Like one will be really collective focus because their previous generation was all me focused. And then the next one will then become all me focused because the parents were all just about collective focus. Like in Asia, in KL, like the millennials are now becoming more me focused and repelling against the parental tyranny of like everyone must become engineers, and now they're starting to, or doctors and whatnot, and now they're starting, or even just your general social norms. um so there's kind of this rebellion against patriarchy kind of from these lingering effects. But the interesting thing is these moral terms, to yearn, burns out, prevailing social mood swings. So the moral economic theory that I have is that um, economics comes first and morality adapts to it. So what isn't economical ceases to be moral, and what is economical becomes moral. And this seems to be like another little citation I can include.
The
And I
materialist
finally write.
dialectic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
So yeah.
also,
So
like, you can see that within like Nietzsche as well, the genealogy of morals and beyond good and evil. And it's funny, in this paper, he actually says that, I think this theory, I forget the exact term, the term of the theory, but it's drawing from a couple of thinkers, such as Marx, even, and sort of having that sort of like political or the materialist dialectic of history that you're sort of,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. Or even with veganism, like this is the initial way that I came to that theory, was that veganism wouldn't happen if it wasn't for supermarkets. Like it wouldn't be a moral imperative in the West to care about veganism if we didn't have supermarkets. Like if we still required to kill animals every single day, then the cognitive dissonance would prevent that achievement because it wouldn't be economical. We would starve.
Right.
And then you end up, yeah.
Yeah, and a similar argument can be made for the abolition of slavery within the South, where like you have the North that were reliant upon the industrialization of many commodities and things like that, and then you have the South that are still reliant upon heavy expenditures of harvesting cotton, and like you have to have a lot of slaves in order to get a lot of cotton. And that's the thing, if you have that's like or you're localizing all your resources on this one gambit, and then when the North just basically shut off all access the South had in being able to export their goods to, say, like England and elsewhere, then that just like completely shut off their ability to produce enough money in order to actually go out and win the war. And so that there's a lot of like economic terms that are taking place here that influence our current present complete abolition of any sort of slavery type talk. Like slavery is the greatest moral sin that you could have made within our history, and that's the thing. Like we've built upon that through our economic foundations that have brought us there.
Well, it's also in terms of the options for work, right? Because if all you care about is skillless manual labor, slavery is fantastic means of production. But if you require anything that requires creativity, slavery isn't an option. And we move to an economy that actually requires more developed skills. And the ways you invest in people to develop those skills isn't through a whip, it's through consent and reward. And so in which case then we like the free market is which includes abolition of slavery, is more profitable for that industry. So abolishing slavery is more profitable in areas where the market permits it to. Now, this is interesting because sex slavery is still a thing in many parts of the world, right? And in those conditions, it is still more profitable to sell your child than it is to provide by any other means. Prostitution is still a common practice in many parts of the world, because for many women, it's more profitable to earn, to participate in prostitution than it is, by any of the other work that she may not even be able to do. I recently just watched a movie called The Isle, and it was about like a woman in a fisherman's village in either China or Korea, and she was kind of the prostitute for the town. But the fishermen, it's like, if they're earning like 10 cents a day or like $1 a day, and then she could earn like $10 in like 10 minutes or like $1 in a minute, something like that, like a 10 times income, then it's actually beneficial for her ability to provide for a family to opt for that. And they do. That was a consensual job. It wasn't sex slavery. But even for sex slavery, we'll see, or even modern slavery, one of the things they did immediately after reading this was like, how is modern slavery still practiced? And it's actually really interesting. It's slavery's kind of changed forms a little bit, but that'll be a topic for another discussion. So these are the things, so just another thing here, which is in modern economies, in contrast, the demand for labor is much more dynamic and can change as a result of technological advances, investments in physical and human capital. The balance of supply and demand for labor can be affected by international flows of people and jobs, more complex than agrarian societies. So this is interesting, right? Because if your economy is still just manual labor, immigration is a threat to the supply of jobs for you. However, if your economy is actually incredibly complex, incredibly broad in its offerings, then and allows a wide array of sophisticated jobs, then immigration isn't necessarily a threat. So for instance, and it can even enhance because, say, if I live in Kuala Lumpur rather than in Sydney, I'm now injecting a software engineer's salary into their economy when I purchase goods. And that actually stimulates their economy. So by injecting more employed people into your economy, it actually promotes more trade within.
I see. So like in that circumstance, you're not like taking a job from the rest of the people there. You're actually bringing the job that you already had into their economy and stimulating it through the income that you're making through your work. Whereas
so you
concern that like I know a lot of like more right-leaning people are having, and what likely led to the election of Donald Trump is the concern about immigration coming in, taking over jobs that are for the people. And so now there's a competition taking place over what jobs the American people have versus the jobs that are being taken by the immigrants coming in. And it is true that even like it's still, even with like the immigration coming in, that's stimulating to the GDP of the economy, because any corporations will want to pay the lowest amount in order for the highest goods, so they can produce. If they can get labor at a cheaper cost than buying it from American workers, then all the better for them. But it's just coming at a cost to the American people within the society. And so there's the other sort of drawback to that as well.
Well, even
it's
in
funny that's the typical sort of response from like people of a more left-leaning nature, is the fact that it raises GDP, the immigration. But I think it's especially funny kind of coming from leftists, because you're drawing upon you're like considering people from an economic worth, which is exactly like Marx's critique of capitalism, is that it treats people as the commodity producers or value creators, and that's like all they're good for. That's what a person is the fact that it raises the GDP in the nation, and that's what a person is supposed to be. And so like it's so funny to see that same sort of lens being applied in order to sort of justify mass immigration coming in from a leftist perspective. Or not just leftist, but just any left-leaning perspective.
Well, I mean, where it becomes an issue is a lot with that personality or that value system is when they conflate like a job with an identity, and when they then conflate an identity with a character or a person, right? Like a person is separate from their identity, and their identity is separate from the job. And where that conflation happens, then people will think, I'm my job, and then they'll get a whole array of things occur. However, at the same time, when let me, because I want to clarify a point that you raised when you said, that immigration in can stimulate the local economy. It's stimulating a hyperlocal economy, because it will only stimulate the national economy if its effects trickle out. And this is part of the hyper elite, what was the word that he used in this? The elite overproduction, right? Which is that, so for instance, getting engineers working at Google and on automation is something that makes the elite of engineer class, of the knowledge worker class, very more profitable. And they may not actually value goods that, like, say, the oil producers or the car producers, or all these jobs that people who are typically conservative, which is lower on openness, and there's some correlation with lower intelligence there, not that that's a bad thing, to that they're impacted on. So for instance, they're working as, in machinery, or working as car drivers. So if you eliminate, like, AI driving eliminates them, then that isn't actually something that benefits the car driver's local economy. It benefits the consumers of the car driver, but not those supplying car driving jobs, right? So that's something where their quality of life diminishes, which was talked about earlier, and then they would want to have a revolt. So this is one of the issues, which is also surprising, because like minimum wage is something that eliminates any job below that wage. It just gets rid of them. It's to say this job is beneath our sentiments as a society. And we're not going to entertain it. It's morally reprehensible. And then it forces those jobs to then go into the welfare or the training system. But not everyone can be trained, and not everyone has the opportunity, especially if they're coming from all the issues that a lower class throws upon you, such as domestic abuse, crime, high crime rates, all these other issues. So then they're just battling to stay alive, and then they have to also retrain for multiple years. So then it's much easier. The incentive is just to still or revolt against the system. Like, hey, if I just blow up Tesla headquarters, now we'll have taxi jobs again, right? Yep. And
that's exactly the thing. Plus, it's the case that, like, if like society is progressing to a point where the new jobs that are being produced surpass the skill level of the workers that jobs are being replaced, that just leads the people in those jobs realize like, oh, I am out of a job and I'm no longer producing something to society. And that's even going back to a point you made earlier that like a man is more than the job that they have. And I agree that that's like the ideal that we ought to produce. Like we ought to instill like people are of value even if they are unemployed. That like want to give that idea to people. But that's the thing. I don't know how much that can really be sold unless you have some sort of like broader community, and because that's the thing. People build up their identities based on their group that they're within. And I think that men especially base their value, their sense of self-worth based upon how much they can produce value towards others. And that's primarily within a job. And so if people are losing their jobs, there's a strong correlation between unemployment and male suicide. And so
or even their wife, it's like, it's also the roles. Like the males generally define themselves by the roles that they are, or which is the use that they provide others. So like when a male gets divorced, their chance of suicide increases by 21 times. That's insane, right? So but for the usefulness, it is a difficult sale, but that's not the sale I was making. The sale is that if you can separate person from persona and persona from identity and then identity from job, then it allows you the ability to transcend and the ability to cope and overcome that distance of when you lose a job. But if you hold on to that, where I like, especially like when you have generations of farmers and now suddenly their area is no longer suitable for farming because of economic development and they get bought out. Like that is a huge impact to identity. But the only option for them is either to revolt or to transcend. And we need to opt for more people to kill themselves intellectually so they can continue and prosper as a new life physically.
Well, it's not killing themselves intellectually. It's killing their conception of themselves as only some sort of market resource or market capitalistic resource, and rather having some sort of identity besides that. Because that's the thing, I think, especially within sort of a modern secular capitalistic society, your core identity is what you do. And so if you lose what you do, then your core identity is lost. And so that's why there needs to be these sorts of like decentralized identities that people can have and build up through social interactions, and like fatherhood would be one, or being within a religious community, or many other different sorts of options. But that's the thing, like by giving up or it's not giving up, but losing your core identity as a career or value producer, that's a hard identity to lose, especially for men.
Yeah, okay, so this touches on part of our previous papers, and as well as like especially the Mormonism discussion I had with Justin, which you can search as like Mormonism and transcendence or something like that. So in it, it's important. So let's say someone's identity is threatened, that multi-generational farmer, or let's say the religion. Like for instance, with Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, it's harder to justify the existence of God as we become more, what do you call it? Cognitively cognitively able. It's fine. I'll go with that. Right. And then but so one of the things is, let's say our identity is being threatened. We don't want that transcendence to just be delegation to another tribe, because we will just repeat the same cyclic process, which is that, hey, this tribal allegiance was threatened. Now it's no longer sustainable to uphold. I'm going to now move to the next one, right? So this could be like Mormons, having their identity being a bit more liberal personality traits, being threatened, then moving into SJW territory or whatever it is, like other social causes that they treat with religious fervor. And then they would then have experiences in their life that contradict that emotional fervor. And then they have the same cognitive dissonance battle again, where their identity is now threatened because they took a false god in a ideology instead of the capital G God that Peterson talks about, which is the objective reality, the truth that we were always seeking. So that's like another little nuance there where it's like, because one of these things is, again, this like the symptoms will always happen, like these little effects over time. It's just, but the thing we can change is how we choose to uh, uh, transcend that cycle or escape from that cycle. Click the escape hatch and or the eject seat, right, and then jump out with some new psycho technologies. And that's something I want to talk. Hopefully, we can interview this author of this paper because I really want to find out, and maybe he's covered it in his other paper that deals with fundamentals, which is the role of psychotechnologies. Because some psychotechnologies, such as the conception of liberty, these are transformative ones that change nations, especially with, or even like the idea of monogamy. Like that's another psychotechnology, right? It's relationships, but this is an idea, a practice that we're having. It's an idea that we are practicing, right? And that changes nations. It moves people from intragender competition to intragender cooperation, and that allows a society to scale beyond just tribes. So these are, it's interesting because, and I think liberty is the psychotechnology here that is being tested and deployed. That seems to be what this era of battle is about. And after this cycle, maybe there's a new idea that maybe, the next generation will now see it, or the generation after, with something we haven't considered yet that will then build across. But it certainly seems liberty is the fight, especially considering some things I'll go over on more personal matters, considering modern politics across the world. Alrighty.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I was just gonna say, I know we don't want to go too long.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. How long do you have?
I could go for another 20, 30 minutes, I guess, but I don't know how long we've already been going so far, just for our audience sake.
Yeah. I'm just gonna read out the I think the audience will be getting tremendous value, John. Alrighty. So I just read this bit out. So the principle of elite overproduction also can be thought of as a consequence of the law of supply and demand. The elites in both agrarian and capitalist societies are consumers of commoner labor. Low price of labor leads not only to declining living standards for a large segment of the population, employees, especially unskilled ones, but also to a favorable economic conjuncture for the elites, more specifically for the economic elites, the employers. There are several important consequences of this development. First, the elites become accustomed to ever greater levels of consumption. In addition, competition for social status drives increased conspicuous consumption. You mentioned this with Jeffrey Miller's views that on making.
That was before we started streaming, though. But yeah. Jeffrey Miller, he's got the ideas of virtue signaling in regards to sexual selection. But yeah.
Yep. So thus the minimum level of resources necessary for maintaining elite status exhibits a runaway growth. Second, the number of elites in relation to the rest of the population increases. Favorable economic conjuncture for the employers enables large numbers of intelligent, hardworking, or simply lucky individuals to accumulate wealth and then attempt to translate it to social status. So we see this where it's like, this is keep up the Joneses. And then you have this common thing of like, why can't people just get a bloody job? It's not that hard. Just express some agency. Stop being so useless. You're homeless because it's your fault, right? So this is like a complete lack of what we call
self-awareness of their own like luckiness or privilege, I guess you could say. But that's something I know. That's something I especially got from reading Nassim Taleb. He points out just how much of this, how much of success is just luck of the draw. Like even for situations where you would expect there would have to be some high amount of competency in order to have this job. No, a lot of it is just like you're the CEO of a company because all the employees are sort of like happen to get things right, and you're happen to be the CEO at this point in time. And so like, oh, this guy's doing a good job, I'm going to promote him, even though like you had nothing to do with it.
Yeah,
He's a great
I'm
author. Though.
I hope though he meant that more as like a humorous way, because uh the if it is just luck, then there wouldn't be disciplines to
Oh,
improve that luck.
sure, sure.
And the other thing is, it's also highly insulting to, in my opinion, to consider, like, let's say Elon Musk, somewhat more successful than the multi-generational farmer in China, right? Which is, they're doing everything they can to be successful within the industry where they are most demanded, in that local environment, right? So it's just like, in terms of wealth, I would definitely agree. Like, your wealth is a lot in terms of, that luck of the draw, right? Like, if you're born in agricultural China versus born in Silicon Valley, your wealth is going to be very different. But I still think your success, because you have to define your success within your context. If I'm
Mhm.
comparing to myself to Elon Musk, or if the Chinese farmer is comparing himself to Elon Musk, that doesn't make any sense. It's just a way to be depressed.
Right, and it's funny he brings that up in I think I think it's Fooled by Randomness. Actually, no, sorry, it's Skin in the Game. That the problem of wealth inequality is that people don't judge their success based upon themselves or who they were in the past. They judge it based upon who they see around them. And so, if you're living across the street from your neighbor who just got a $10 million house, and you're like, man, what am I doing wrong? Because like I had the exact same upbringing as he did. What is wrong with me? And that's the
Right.
thing. He had this huge upgrade, a lot to do with the fact that he was lucky. Like his example is, it's a stock trader, and so it's funny. Nassim Taleb comes from stock trading
Right.
history, and a lot of it is just guessing and then being lucky with your guesses. And so that's,
Yeah.
and then
But again,
people
that
tend to assume that the reason they were lucky was because they were smart, and so they assume, oh man, I'm really important because
yeah.
I happened to get lucky this one time. And then the
Yeah.
other guy is just,
I
yeah, what's wrong? Yeah,
yeah. Yeah. It does seem though that he's using that as like a tool for achieving humility rather than a specific, like, as a perceptual device. Because if that's going to be like an actual judgment call, it's highly insulting to the disciplines to improve luck. Or like, even as a stock trader, there's disciplines to improve luck. And even Elon Musk, like, if Elon Musk stayed in
mm-hmm.
South Africa, he wouldn't have that opportunity. But there's just a side argument.
Yeah,
But he deliberately chose to move out, right? So
right,
Elon Musk's career is like any successful person at some point. Yeah, you can either attribute entirely luck, or you can improve your those chances by deliberately always saying,
right.
"How can I
And,
increase my opportunity for luck?"
and that's the thing. Like for a lot of these things, there's going to
Yeah,
be both. Like it's just the fact that Elon Musk put in a lot of hard work and he also got lucky. And that's the thing. Like you're going to have
yeah,
like what 100 different entrepreneurs that try to like start up a business, and then
right,
90% of them fail, and then
right,
10 of them
yeah,
become like huge
yeah,
yeah, go
right, right,
gangbusters.
right, right. Yeah, so
And
he's probably using that
all
in
of them
terms,
worked hard,
right?
but
Yeah,
only a few of them were
right.
lucky enough to actually hit it big. Yeah.
Right, yeah, that's like that insult to like the self-help thing, where you ask like famous CEO or whatever, and I'll be like, "What did you do?" And then they just say something that everyone else did, right? Or
Yeah.
that 90% of the other failures did, which is like, just compete more than everybody else. And it'll be like, all righty. Yeah. But the other thing interesting for that is about that peer evaluation. I actually attended this thing on um how to be an anti-racist or diversity training thing, because I thought it would be interesting to hear those arguments. Um, and obviously, I also want to improve. So if they have good arguments,
Yeah.
I will.
Yeah.
Uh,
You're, if
but,
anyone, you deserve to go to an anti-racist
right.
training.
So I attended it, and she started off with something like, I live in the UK. I'm a black woman. I look at my peers and my friends. They're all black, and when I go, or not all, my friends are, people like me or people like the society. They resemble the demographics. But then when I go to work, it's not people like me. And then there's that comparison of evaluation. Am I good enough? Was it that? Marcus Brownlee did a good video on such a thing. But at the same time, that's falling into that same type of trap, which is then to assume that everybody is like you. And that's the agreeable trap. Not everyone is like you. And
Right.
especially when different cultures and subcultures and identities, like an identity is just a cluster of traits, be it personal or physical traits. But those identities then portray different values, different desires, right? And things that are important to them. So, like, if you're going to say, like, well, why isn't there more, underprivileged open source coders? Well, to do open source, you're working for free, investing dozens of hours a week into something for free. People don't have that liberty. That's the liberty
Right.
exclusive to people who have, some would call it privilege, but it's more like a generational effort to obtain wealth for your children so they have the luxury of freedom and that higher uh not higher in terms of a moral thing, but just higher to achieve ability of cognitive freedom versus being constrained to physical labor.
Right. And that's a really interesting question, is to like, how much do we want to allow people to inherit, what's the opposite of inherit? Like to pass on their success to their children. Like, do we want it
Right.
to be that every person that is born in the United States or Australia or
Right.
Canada, whatever, has an equal footing with everyone else? Or do we want to allow it that the people that succeeded in America, they get the privilege, I guess, to pass on a bit of success to their children so that they at least
Right.
have that upper
Right.
ground where they could become the next Elon Musk, the next Bill Gates. So that somebody
Yeah.
uh, giving them these opportunities. Like, do we? Because that's the thing, we're not going to be able to give everyone these opportunities
Yeah.
because there's differences in class. Yeah.
It's
It's hard.
such a humorous argument because it's an argument that could only be created by people who have no intent of having children, right? And if there's no intent on having children, like that's the thing. To have children, you have to have an intent to make the life as wonderful as possible,
Right.
right? And you want to accumulate as much mass. And for many people, like you get, the wife gets pregnant and then it's just like, shit, I need to get my life together and now I need to work, right? Because you don't have any other option, right? So so the whole desire to provide the best for your or for your family is one of the main focuses of economic production. So that is earned, like the benefits that the child gets is what the parents earn for them. And I can get that, like to call that, and I've seen like arguments over the past week calling that just unearned privilege. And it's just like, that is so insulting to your ancestors, like who worked incredibly hard. Like actually, I'll show you this. Check this out. This is I'll just share my entire desktop. Uh, do you see that? The picture?
Oh yeah. Oh man.
Yeah, this is my wallpaper, right? Like this is an unearned privilege. This is kids working, right, to make their lives better for their family, right? Because if you didn't, you would freeze to death when winter came,
Mhm. Yeah, that
right?
was something like that
That's our
heavily hit me.
grandparents.
That was something that heavily hit me after you forced me to watch Grave of the Fireflies. Is just to see how much the modern society has just sort of disregarded all of the sacrifices made by our ancestors, and like how much we're spitting on their graves like every day of our life by not following with whatever values or ideas that they had that they were working towards. They were like working towards a future that we've just decided, nah, we're not going to do it anymore. And they sweat, bled, and killed and died for this future that we've just gone a different way with. Like,
Yeah.
there's a quote from it's not Winston Churchill, G.K. Chesterton, that democracy is allowing your ancestors to have a vote. Democracy is sorry, I messed that up. Tradition is allowing your ancestors to have a vote. Tradition is the democracy of the dead. Because that's the thing, like I see so often this like slander and like almost it feels like a self-hatred in a sense, even though it's a hatred of your ancestors. Like, oh,
Right.
my ancestors were slave owners, and so I disavow everything that they did, and like I hate my ancestors for coming to America and killing the native population and all of that. And like I can understand there's a lot of immoral things that our ancestors have done when looked through our standards today, and even probably looking from the standards of the time as well. There's a lot of heinous atrocities that have happened throughout history, but to just throw all of their work and effort and sacrifices that they've made just so that you can live here in the luxury of your own time period, it is just so, I don't know, it cheapens everything that they've committed and sacrificed for us.
Yeah. And if there's a new, like, if this is a new argument to anyone, this talk by Dr. Yaron Brook, Equal is Unfair, the Inequality Advantage, this is fantastic. Because he reframes a lot of this as envy, which is that these differences, right? This is fueled by envy, which is a sin. And it's really interesting. And like, that's the thing again, like, you know, to some extent, maybe that, you know, like as maybe someone who leans on determinism, right? Being an engineer, luck is something where you do not yet understand the consequences which arose it. Whereas, you know, if is our luck here, you know, just because we don't understand consequences that arose through thousands of years, right? It's the same thing. Like for, yeah, I think that illustrates the point. Alrighty. Alrighty, so okay. As a result, upward mobility into the ranks of the elites will greatly overmatch downward mobility. The third consequence is that the twin processes for declining living standards for the commoners and increasing consumption levels for the elites will drive up socio-economic inequality. This is kind of what we talked about before with like blow up Tesla, you know, things like that, or the immigration coming in. It's hyperlocal benefits. Okay, as a result, the growth in elite appetites and numbers, the proportion of the total economic pie consumed by them will increase, leading to a condition that has been termed elite overproduction. Another paper by Turchin, 2 actual papers he's used that. Okay, the intra-elite competition for limited elite positions in the economy and government becomes fierce. This is another thing, which is libertarianism seems to have an intent to fix at least this problem here. Competition will be particularly intense for government positions whose supply is relatively inelastic, especially at the top. Yep.
Well, hold on. Isn't libertarianism sort of built around the idea of competition? Or maybe.
Well, this is specifically talking about government, which is that campaigning for power, monopolistic power. So the more elite you become from the production, then the more lobbying and influence you can do over the coercive force. And this makes the competition between the elite more fierce and perhaps more dodgy.
I see. And so libertarianism wants to remove that, because what is that? Like crony capitalism, where the corporations with the most money can buy their policies that help promote them. But that's like anti-libertarian from your understanding, right?
Yeah, because libertarianism has 2 different angles. Like left libertarian is like the equality, the compassion side, and then the right libertarian is the economic side. And then they meet together to form that bit. But so you have the bit where it's like what was the question, John?
It was like for crony capitalism, where you like you build up enough resources, and then that gives you the ability to sort of like buy your policies that help you,
and
hurt everybody else.
Yeah, so there shouldn't be anything where, like, say for democracy, like the whole idea of democracy is that it's better than feudalism, and feudalism, a minority oppresses the majority. In a democracy, the majority oppresses a minority. But then, and it's hard because then you could influence, with crony capitalism is the elite can then influence that to then oppress, again, kind of return or rebalance that to where there's a minority oppressing the majority. Like, for instance, like NRA, like the Snowden revelations, anything Assange has leaked, things like that. These are just all ways of like, wait, is the government actually working for us? And because there's no competition to the government, well, what can we actually do? But then you have different things like, there's different ways of balancing that out in many different attempts. It's just that's the one intent there. All right. So a democratic system of government may allow for non-violent rotation of political elites. But ultimately, this depends on a willingness of established elites to relinquish access to power positions to ever-growing numbers of elite aspirants. As a result, elite overproduction increases the probability of violent intra-elite conflict. So this is and this is also why everyone's terrified of Trump, right? Because they realize like the system in the wrong hands may be abused. But then, depending on your value system, you're either offended when a Republican gets in, or you're you're either concerned when a Republican gets in, or you're concerned when a Democrat gets in, right? So it's just what are the causes of that concern? Because it's still it's those problems are still inherent in the system, and then you have to inherently trust the guidance. So if you can fix the system, which is interesting, like again, this is like a call for like, hey, the police system will always have cost to that enforcement. Let's defund the police system and go back into private security.
So it's interesting though how this can apply even to within the economic domain as well. Like, so like say Silicon Valley, that's a highly valued thing because you have people like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, things like that. And so everybody's moving into the Silicon Valley to try to sort of get their startup and things like that. Whereas then there's going to be sort of this, well, I guess there is still quite a bit of a opening in the market for more people in here. But if it was for some job that there was sort of a limitation, somebody had sort of gotten the monopoly and everybody else is just underneath them, it's all in their interest to move up the hierarchy somehow. And since there's no other avenue to do so except through violent competition, then that's the avenues in which the more prudential actors will take.
Right. And well, this is one of the crazy things of like just the identitarian politics that the USA is just what do you call it, overwhelmed with, which is that the as long as you're attaching so much to the identity, it's the same thing like that generational farmer, or sorry, the generational cab. That's probably not a thing. Maybe back with the horse and the chariots, he was still a cab driver, a long lineage of cab drivers or whatever, right? And then the AI guys come, like, if you say that you're something more than your identity, then you offer that transcendence route, the psychotechnology of transcendence. But if you then say you're only your identity and your identity is what defines you, then your only solution is to rebel and riot against automated cars or against automation. So this is interesting, right? Because I have the comment here, like, why isn't, like, for a psychotechnology to break out of this, the third consequence is that the twin process for declining standards and commoners and increasing consumption levels for elites will drive up socioeconomic quality. But isn't promotion or automation good? So those are like some psychotechnologies or economic inventions that may actually change the cycle a little bit. But then again, if you have like minimum wage, then promotions and a lot of those things, so that's the thing, like whole other, I mean, won't delve in further. All right, non-free market, yep, okay. Australia help fees, okay, so this is fascinating. All right, jobs and age reign as risk factors. The Arab world built colleges, but not jobs. Unemployment broad among regions' angry youth is high among educated.
Read that the sentence before that, because I really appreciate it. It actually like lays out what are the predictions that this theory make, and then where can we observe it elsewhere. And like he brings it up with in regards to the Arab countries in 2011.
All right, all main ingredients postulated by the theory appear to be present. Rapid population growth resulting in youth bulges, growing economic inequality with poorer population strata increasingly immiserated, while the incomes at the top exhibit runaway growth, and elite overproduction as evidenced by a remarkable expansion of the numbers of university-educated youths without job prospects, Now, structural demographic processes are directly referred to in such articles in the popular press as jobs and age reign as risk factors for Mid-East uprisings. And Arab world built colleges, but not jobs. Unemployment broad
Mm.
among regions, angry youth is high among
Oh
rich
man.
lords.
Yeah,
So,
that's wow. That's really incredible. So like by bringing in education, but not having the jobs that the educated class would be, like what they're um, a compatible fit with, then you're just basically stirring up political instability there because you're creating an elite class without an avenue for them to exhibit their elite status.
right. And it also creates a thing where the university becomes something that isn't about job prospects. It becomes a home.
Mm.
Um, and and this is interesting. Australia actually has a solution to this. So, like, I remember talking with some Europeans a few years ago, and I was like absolutely horrified at the tax rates. And I was just like, "What is the tax paying for?" And they're like, "Free education." I was like, "What are you talking about?" And like, yeah, people are entitled to an education. I was like, "What? Even if they don't use it?" And they're like, what do you mean? And I was like, okay, in Australia, when you can get a loan from the government, and then when you, and then it pays off from like 8% or something of your income, once you go over like $40,000, right? So you can still study whatever you want. But then that was the system that I grew up. That was called HEX. But then since 2017, they changed it into one called HELP. Now with the HELP system, they subsidize degrees that are undersupplied by up to like 85% on those loans. And degrees that are oversupplied, they penalize by up to 250%. So, for instance, certain industries, there's way too much supply. So they've now penalizing. So that loan that would have been like maybe $200,000 for those type of degree, like let's say a doctor, or whatever it is. I can't remember. They have a whole list of things published. I'm just going to use doctor as an example. I'm not sure if that was actually one. Right, so a doctor degree, maybe 200,000 years, 8 years of education or something like that, right? $200,000, 8 years of education. Now that would become 600,050 because of that jump. I think that's right. 200,000 times by 2.5. No, sorry, $500,000. That loan will now be paid off from that 8%. Now, but then for some jobs, for instance, like psychologist was like oversupplied, but psychiatrist and clinical psychologists were like undersupplied. No, counselor was oversupplied, but psychologists and clinical psychologists and psychiatrists were undersupplied. So then those ones, you would only pay 15% of that degree. So you'd only pay like 20 grand. So it's a way of making it so, hey, everyone gets a free education, but we're also going to penalize you if you're going to pick something that's useless. so
Is it a penalization or is it just a like incentive to go towards the jobs that are in demand?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's an incentive disincentive structure, right? So yeah. So I think like that's another thing. Like Australia's got a lot right. I think if America stopped being like USA, 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 and actually were like looked out to the rest of the world, maybe that they would find some things worth taking. Alrighty.
No,
right,
USA, USA, USA.
All right, civil wars have many causes. Here I am concerned with universal factors. We talked about this before, so he's caring about things that apply regardless of individual circumstances. So in summary, the theory suggests the following generalization. Labor oversupply should lead to falling living standards and elite overproduction, which in turn should result in a wave of prolonged and intense social political instability. Population growth causes political violence indirectly. Its effect is mediated through social structures. Most importantly, power relations between the elites and general population and within the elites. So I asked why. I think we covered it in this conversation. Furthermore, population growth is not the only mechanism that can lead to labor oversupply. So here we talked about the immigration argument. We've already talked about that. Alrighty.
Is that the next paper that you of his that you wanted to look into? Because that's a topic I'd be interested in.
Yeah, so the next paper is like fundamental reasons. I haven't looked into that, but yeah, I sent out a tweet saying, we're doing it, and he responded back with a thing like, hey, well, this is a good follow-up of another one of his papers, which he co-wrote with another researcher. So yeah, we can go over that one. Alrighty, then to go back to it. So okay, database. So this is how we constructed the database. Political instability is defined here as violent group level conflict within a state. How do psychotechnologies change cycles, e.g. liberty? Yep, we talked about that. Such a conservative approach excludes a number of legitimate instability events, but it has two advantages. First, it clearly demarcates political violence from peaceful demonstrations and nonviolent labor strikes that are part of the normal functioning democratic society, and therefore are not instances of political instability. So I've got, okay, this is, let me see if I can read this. Mimetic parasitism
So
isn't
the rest
just about.
of this paper goes. Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah.
Read your note.
Yeah.
Go ahead, read your
so
note.
You're so jumpy, John. All right. Mimetic parasitism isn't just about economic warfare. It's also about destroying nations. Okay, so this is something I talked about in the last one with Justin, which is that yeah, it's okay. So political violence from peaceful demonstrations and non-violence. So one of the other things to throw into this about the consideration value of this type of thing is from the last conversation I had, what did we name it? The reinforcing spirals model, and our video was called, reinforcing spirals model. So in that one, in 2016 or 2017, it was discovered that Russia was infiltrating many minority and social justice movements to deliberately create division and to work up tensions. Now, we also see this type of behavior with China, with their propaganda department, and Russia. Hold up.
Russia?
Oh, is this my CPU? Because you're breaking up a bit for me, but I think it could be on my side.
Yeah.
Hold up. Let me just stop the share. I think maybe the recording. What's going on? Are you still there?
Yes. That's my bad.
All right, I'm just gonna assume that it's on your side, and I'm gonna keep going.
My high CPU usage. Oh, maybe it was tough. You can't even hear me. Oh no. Oh, reconnect.
Yeah, I can hear you, but your video's not working. Maybe just turn off your video. Okay, you're back.
Okay.
Alrighty, so yeah, so that was in the last one. Probably just watch the last one because I don't want to rehash that. But the idea was, okay, so mimetic parasitism could be caused as or be done as a tactic for economic warfare. So, for instance, if we can make USA's economy unstable due to the amount of noise that affects productivity from the amount of social or political division, then that affects the productivity, and then the other nations can leap ahead. And economics is really important in this, and this is something I never understood before when it comes to nation states, which is that if you don't have a strong economy, you are ripe to be pillaged by a stronger economy. You just don't have the means. This is played all throughout history, right? And if anyone's ever played the game Risk, it's the exact same thing, which is that you want to expand your territory, you'll form allegiances, but 95% of the time, who you're playing with doesn't give a damn about honor. They will kill you as soon as you offer them no leverage. So you need to make sure you offer people leverage, otherwise the cruel will exploit you.
Yeah, well, that's the thing with Risk is you can't win with two different people on the map. Only one can be the winner. So
yeah,
the very nature of the game is such that any sorts of allegiances will only be temporary.
Right. But even still, like I played it with like 5% of people, and myself included. I'll keep my buddy on as like the second last or something like that. Like I'll kill all the enemies we were paired up and then I'll verse him, right? Just to like, to give them dignity, right? But 95% of people don't play that. That was a very important lesson for me that I took away from that game. But yeah, so then we can see this where, hey, maybe it's not just actually about economic warfare. When we see this, it goes in these huge cycles, right? Like these 50-year cycles, a lot of death. Maybe it's actually not about necessary economic warfare to an extent, or as the highest goal, but maybe the higher goal is actually complete destabilization of a nation, like of the government of a nation. And I think maybe that's actually the goal here. And that seems to be interesting. Like that's what the nations were terrified about with the Cold War, was these destabilizational forces on the nation. That's also why the art of killing, or the act of killing, it's a documentary about how Indonesia, they just rounded up all the communists and shot them. Like like rivers flowed with blood.
Wow.
But they won that mimetic, like they won that mimetic war. They eliminated that mimetic threat. Now, the same thing, like a communist would consider capitalism a mimetic threat. So at least for that, I'm just saying, right? So that's really interesting. Yeah, so second and even more important, events that involve loss of life are much more likely. Okay, so this is how he's gone about creating everything. So I said this, yep.
Before we go on, can we like maybe advocate a less harsh way of resolving mimetic threats?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's the transcendence and the cognitive dissonance thing. I talked a lot with Justin in the previous thing, but yeah, the whole Viveki series is great. All the other videos in Beverly, we've talked a lot about that. Definitely, yeah. All right, so this is a lot about the now he's defining. Okay, shit. So what is this? This is can lynchings be used to foreshadow political instability? So this is looking at one of his previous things and one of the fallouts. So one of the theories I have, he didn't cover it into this, but one of the things to raise is, I think the reason why lynchings has decreased since the 1960s is because the technology to catch people is better, right? Like it's kind of funny always watching like crime movies like back in the 60s, and it's just like you could pretty much get away with anything really. And like now, and like even like 200 years ago, like you could be an Albert Fish and just like kidnap children and do all sorts of things, like hundreds of victims, right? When like people to do that, like they probably still exist, but they're probably exceptionally talented, right? When like when now it's just like to steal anything, like you could do it, but it's just like to pull things out for a sustainability of time is very difficult, especially like with CCTV, with internet footprints, with smartphone footprints, with all the different things, right? Like technology makes this type of individual crime very difficult. That's why group crime are like the black blocs, like they wear the face masks. Like the whole idea is with a group, you now fade into an anonymity, and that is your legal defense. And you can even argue that from a sanity thing. I got swept up. I was no longer myself, or whatever it is. So that's kind of interesting. So I wonder about this, like whether or not lynchings could have been used to foreshadow. So whether or not you could think of lynchings like what the left is always crying is a little bit not. It has undertones that I wasn't intending. I meant like decrying, the perceived, or this, whether or not it's true or whatnot, doesn't matter, but they're decrying, like, say, lynchings against transgender people, right? In the same way that there was lynchings against gays. So I wonder then, because that would then cause an identity threat, then the group would now occur, which then could attack. So I wonder whether or not it can be used for foreshadowing. All right, I've highlighted this bit. The only difference between a rampage shooter and a suicide bomber is the weapon used to kill. Both aim not at individual people, but at groups, social or political institutions, or entire societies. This was, it was fascinating how he broke these things down. So like lynchings, they could be termed as extra legal. There's also a class of events called terrorism. Within terrorism, there's assassination, There's also these type of defenses and then assassinations could be political, religious, ethnic, or racial. There's also rampages. These are like the mass shooters.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
uh,
I wonder if one of the aspects of why lynchings don't play as much of a feature is because, like, his criteria for there to be an event of political instability that he's counting is if it's a fatality of 12 or more people, and
right,
while it was a case that there were in our past history, or there in our past history, lynchings of that amount of people, anytime now that you might have a lynching on some occasion, it would be mostly from smaller groups of people, of like, say, maybe 4 or 5 people doing it to just 1 or 2 people, rather than
right,
like, oh, we're gonna get the town together and then lynch all yeah,
right,
kill all these black people or something like that.
right. I also wonder because he used this to, like, identify the discrimination he used to amass the data, and then whether or not he then considered that data going forward. Because you still have to have discrimination while you're amassing. Because he talks later about the different data sources, and then what he did to overcome possible biases. So it could be like, yeah, there's probably extra contemplation there, and it's good you raised that about the lynchings issue, because maybe some lynchings were included, some weren't,
Mhm.
because there wasn't a way to actually determine whether or not they were political or not, or their nature. But this one's fascinating. This idea or this acknowledgement.
Mhm.
Yeah. So he considers like school or shooting rampages to actually be similar to suicide bomber, which is suicide terrorism.
Mhm.
Because in a large portion of mass shootings, the perpetrators are killed by the police or shoot themselves. I think
Mhm.
that's quite a profound insight there. Um, and then he doesn't include things against family or anyone convicted of mental
Mhm.
institutions or crime, bank robberies, or gang disputes, because they're not inherently political. They're
Mhm.
just, economic or
Right.
whatever other things they could be.
Yeah. So what was there, like, three main criterias of the racial, political, and terrorist? Those were the three sort of like main events that are counted in his. I think those were
Right.
the three. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the reasoning, not the
Right.
events.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
events
Yeah.
were
Exactly.
yeah,
And
terrorism,
some
lynchings, and riots.
some of them were multifaceted, like the LA riots were racially
Yeah.
motivated as well as politically motivated. And
Right.
and there was also, yeah. So there's lynchings, and terrorism. Yeah, those were the
Yep.
three. And then the
Yep.
motivations were like for economic reasons, or like labor disputes. Those were some motivations for some of them, and yeah,
Yep.
several other things as well.
Yeah. And then what's interesting is, so some are multifaceted, but then some uh, also don't have any reason, which was interesting.
Right.
So he's kind of talking about how he goes through that. So this is interesting.
Yeah.
This is again like the Civil War, which is a few events, but highly cohesive, but a lot of deaths.
Right.
When here, there was a lot of events, not many deaths. But in here, we're seeing a lot of an increase in events, but a larger increase in deaths. And I think this is just technology, which is before, if you wanted to kill 1,000 or 100 people, it was difficult to do it.
Mm.
You had to build a group, you had to get the weaponry, things like that. Where now access to technology through innovation has increased, and also the access to other minds has increased, the ability to amass. So
Yeah.
the risk of a decentralized threat is way higher and way more serious, which is then why the NRA and the Snowden revelations, the mass surveillance, and also uh, constraints on liberty of offending possible of offense that may provoke a decentralized threat,
Right.
things like that, because then that would be disturbing the peace. So you have this wide and like as the technology increases for the capacity to do harm, the central authority has an ability to do that without reducing liberties. But then that causes revolt back outwards, which is what I've talked about for a few years now, and which was the need for a decentralized force. Alrighty, so
All right. It's 11 o'clock for me here.
Yeah.
So if you want to wrap up, or if
Yeah.
you want, I can head out and you can continue it up on your own. I really don't mind either way.
Can do 5/4. I think I'll probably wrap it up within 20 minutes by just going over these final points. But if that's too late, I think we covered everything that's super valuable
Yes.
to cover together. So I think maybe I'll keep going just to wrap it up, and then yeah, you can watch it back or whatever. But I think yeah, depending on how it goes, maybe we schedule like, or you know, I've already talked with you about what many of the options are.
Right.
So yeah. Alrighty, thanks for staying up, John. Value contributions to this.
Yeah, this was a good conversation. I was actually surprised. At first, I was kind of like, you had brought up the paper, and I wasn't like sure what it was supposed to be about, and I was having a hard time sort of like grasping its importance. But yeah, it's funny. Only like midway through the paper do you kind of get the greater realization of like, oh, this is important because of like could be a great predictor of like what causes political instability, and like what would be the necessary factors in order to have peace for a society. And so like that's super important, man. All right.
Yeah.
So yeah,
and also a calming force, right? Like you know, it kind of is like, okay, these are systems that are operating and these are the symptoms. Like it gives you that bird eye calming perspective. All right, thanks so much, John.
Yep. All right, talk to you guys later. Bye. You guys, including the audience, I guess. All right, see ya. Good night.
Yep. Alrighty, so here some speculation of why this increased. I just mentioned it, which is increased technology and the increased damage that could cause. Oh, wait, I stopped sharing my screen. Jesus, how long have I not been sharing my screen? Alrighty, yeah, so the increased damage here, and yeah, increased potential of damage from decentralized threats. But the other thing is, well, why did it change in 1960, right? I mean, technology has been improving for a while, but we also see we had this little pile of national cohesion. And then we have a lot of anti-war sentiment, especially from the Vietnam War, from what from my understanding of American history. And you also have the civil rights movement, which he talks about a bit. So it's like, okay, as an Aussie, it's like, well, is this hippies? Is this comfort? Is this maternal? Is this fatherless homes? Talked about this a bit earlier. I mean, and he's got this other paper. I think it goes into the more fundamental reasons. So it's all fundamental reasons to understand that particular circumstance rather than the overall pattern. Alrighty. So here we see huge rise in terrorism earlier and diminishing of lynchings, as well as somewhat diminishing rioting up until the last 20 years. Rioting has again increased. So that's interesting, which is the group tensions are increasing. That's the rioting. But also terrorism is getting way more severe, decentralized terrorism. And that's also a lot why decentralized threats makes a lot of sense. I've talked about this before. Happy to talk about it again in more detail. I haven't actually done any specific show on that, but happy to do it if people find it interesting. Alrighty. All right, the sensitivity to rare but bloody events makes the number of deaths a lot. Yeah, okay, that's just explaining how he's gone about it. All right, for 200 years between 1780 and 1980, the most common form that socio-political violence took was the riot. Okay, he's covering what I've gone over. Okay, yep, lynchings, better detective tech, causing the higher cost. So that's why lynchings could be deteriorating. All right, what have I read in here? Identity has changed over time. Is race still relevant? This is not going to be what you perhaps thought it would meant there. So as to issues motivating political violence, the most common is race and ethnicity, followed by labor and politics. Race ethnicity has been an important issue throughout US history and was the common motive of riots, lynchings, and assassins during the peaks of 1870, 1920, and 1970. In contrast, the importance of other issues has waxed and waned. So what I'm trying to find here is, like, let's say if the Gini coefficient goes up, does race tensions diminish? So that would be those type of things. Like, what is it that impacts a race there, especially like as you know, I'm from a much different culture than USA, and I've lived in many different cultures before. So just wondering what the impacts there can be. All right. Hold up. One moment. Something's ringing. Where is that coming from? All right. Hopefully that does not happen again. Alrighty, so here we have our database. So these are the different databases and how we coalesce those two together, and just the ways of managing any statistical or study bias there. So biases of Fox versus CNN versus DeFi. So here, the number of lynching victims for the same period of the USPV database is only 451. The problem is that lethal violence against blacks and certain categories of whites in the South was so common and routinized that the newspapers, especially in the Northeast, simply do not bother to report most of these incidents. And you can see this with modern reporting, which is the different networks have different preferences of what they report. So you're saying, well, if you take them all in account, they kind of cancel each other out. All right, technical versus fundamental. So this bit, he wraps it all up into the history of the USA, and kind of says specifically this event caused this trickling of effects, caused this trickling of effects, caused this trickling of effects. How does it all fall in? Does the theory hold? So rather than particularly being boring, I would just suggest just reading that part of it, because it's worth the read. All right, so DeFi force historical collars. Yep. All right, can changing moral sentiments which reflect, okay, DeFi force, okay. Although they will obviously have a huge impact on the lives of thousands of individuals directly involved as perpetrators, victims, there will be no. Yeah, so the next decade will show which of these alternatives is correct. And then here's some possible alternatives: DeFi force, historical collars. So historical things for crawling that. Actually, yeah, I'm going to read this out because I think it's relevant to what's going on in the world right now. All right. During the second half of the 19th century, the United States experienced a massive wave of socio-political instability. From 1820 to 1860, the estimated number of deaths due to political violence, scaled by the total population, increased 100-fold. From 1860 to 1920, instability remained at high levels. However, during the 3 decades after 1920, it declined 50-fold. In addition to the secular wave, the dynamics of instability exhibited shorter-term peaks, recurring with a period of approximately 50 years. These instability peaks were not dominated by a single use, and the violence took multiple forms, suggesting that they were caused by fundamental social forces affecting the US polity. For example, political violence in the antebellum USA included slave rebellion, a massive wave of urban riots, a prelude to the Civil War in Kansas, called Bleeding Kansas, and even a religious war against the Mormons. This explosion of political violence crested with the American Civil War, the bloodiest war in the history of the USA, which was followed by racial and political conflicts in the South and vigilante violence in the West. Political violence in the years around 1920 similarly took multiple forms and was motivated by diverse issues. During the Red Summer of 1919, there was no fewer than 26 major race riots that collectively caused more than 1,000 fatalities. This was also a period of intense class warfare, with labor strikes becoming increasingly more violent. To give just one example, the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia in 1921 was the largest organized armed uprising in US labor history. It was also the only time in US history when the government used military aircraft against its own people. Elite insecurity was further aroused by the terror campaign conducted by Italian anarchists in electoral challenges from the populists and socialists. The widespread belief among the elites during the Red Scare of 1917 to 1921 was that the country was on the brink of revolution and was not just paranoia. The incidence was political violence events more than doubled during this period, even above the already elevated level characterizing secular instability wave. The last clearly defined peak around 1970 was also due to a variety of incidents, urban riots and violent campus demonstrations, political assassinations, and terrorism. However, the level of violence achieved during this peak was much milder than that during the previous peaks. Extending the sequence of 1870, 1920, and 1970 forward suggests that the next instability peak should occur in the United States around 2020. This is a simple projection rather than a scientific prediction, which requires an understanding of mechanisms bringing about outbreaks of political violence. See Turchin, 2006. The analysis of structural causes of instability waves is beyond the scope of this article and will be published and will be pursued elsewhere. Turchin, forthcoming. However, an examination of the empirical trends in the data suggests that the period since the 1950s has been characterized by a general upward tendency, albeit with significant up and down fluctuations. See Figure 3. The dominant component of the rising trend during the last 3 decades was terrorism, Figure 5, both in its classical form and especially in a novel form of suicide terrorism, the killing rampage. As I discussed earlier, the broad significance of the ongoing explosion in the incidence of shooting rampages is still in question. If these violent incidents are a surface reflection of deeper social shifts taking place in the United States, then they can constitute a truly worrying sign of troubles to come. According to this interpretation, the trajectory is on track towards another instability peak. In that case, rampages should eventually be joined by other forms of political violence, since multiple forms of instability was the pattern in all previous peaks. An alternative hypothesis is that the outbreak of shooting rampages will eventually fizzle out, although they will obviously have a huge impact on the lives of thousands of individuals directly involved as perpetrators or victims. There will be no comparable impact on society as a whole. The next decade will show which of these alternatives is correct. So what are some of the alternatives as well that could address this? So we've got decentralized force, historical dwellers, psychotechnologies, technological inventions, as well as things like for the psychotechnologies, Bouvetki's series is fantastic, as well as Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. Both fantastic ways of crawling that. Okay. So can changing moral sentiments which reflect changing economics be used as a predictor? So yeah, again, talking about the economic morality theory that I have, which is that I wonder whether or not you can predict like instability, immigration, inverse wage, GDP ratio, inverse health, inequality, thin solid line, polarization. So that's what this chart represents. Talked about this at the beginning. These are the different things. So I wonder, in the same way that lynchings could perhaps be used to as a foreshadowing to group instability, perhaps changing moral sentiments, like say searching Twitter and doing analysis on social media of changing moral sentiments will also be a foreshadowing into political instability and violence. Yeah, and then his finale was, we spend an enormous amount of resources, intellectual material, learning how to preserve the physical health of resource of individuals. Shouldn't we invest a similar amount into understanding how to maintain and restore health of whole societies? And to some extent, that's what Beverly's trying to do. It's also what we're building projects, the Beverly Build initiative. This is a Beverly Study initiative. We also the Beverly Build initiative. We're trying to really solve that. And if that's what Beverly's about. Alrighty. So thanks, Sean, for joining me so much. This was covering the paper Dynamics of Political Instability in the United States, 1780 to 2010 by Peter Turchin. Thanks to Peter for writing that. That was a great piece of research. You can get all the details in the description below. This is where the notes will be. Sorry, that's a previous lecture, previous meeting we did. Yeah, you can find all the notes that we've talked about in this here, and the link to the different stuff link will be in the description below. We do these discussions every week. Feel free to be part of them yeah, otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Hope you have a good one. Bye.